And now I
There
believe
we
you're
go.
on screen. There we go.
There we go.
Well, so sorry to shut you out accidentally, and
No worries.
welcome. I was reflecting actually on when we first met, which is now almost a decade ago, I think.
Yeah.
And Headspace was just beginning. Action for Happiness was just beginning. We were off doing a BBC thing together, with me doing a bit of positive psychology, you teaching mindfulness. And wow, the world has changed in so many ways since then. I mean, obviously Action for Happiness has grown quite a bit, but I mean, Headspace has become a household name and a world-changing phenomenon. And of course, the awareness of mental health has gone through the roof. So it's so nice to reconnect with you as we have over the years since that point. It's lovely to have seen that flourishing.
Yeah, no, likewise. Thanks for having me back, Mark. It's a pleasure. I've got to say, by the way, before we start, well, first of all, hi to everyone. And that is the nicest start of a Zoom I've ever had. I don't mean the whole kind of camera thing. I mean, watching the people come up as they come into the Zoom. I mean, what an amazing community of people you have, like from everywhere in the world, literally to like a mile or two up the road here in Santa Monica, to Canada and the Canary Islands and Portugal. I mean, it was New Zealand. It was amazing seeing all the different countries come up.
Yeah, well, we're so grateful for the global community that supports Action for Happiness, but also more importantly, supports this mission we're all on, and you're very much on with Headspace to help create a happier world and a world that's more mindful, compassionate, caring, and wise in the way we respond to things. So this evening's event's called Mindful Living. You're obviously an expert in that, the voice and co-founder of Headspace. So you don't really need any introduction to the audience, but I will just give a quick overview to those who are joining. Thank you folks for being here. I can still see many others joining. We're going to have a chat together, Andy and I, about a few themes which I hope will be really relevant to you right now in this, really difficult time for many of us, looking at how we can use the ideas of mindfulness and the expertise that Andy and colleagues have used at Headspace to help us not only look after ourselves better, but also look after each other better. And then I'm really excited that we're going to have live questions from you and the audience. So do keep your comments coming in on the chat. If it's a bit overloading for you, feel free to minimize the chat and just tune in to Andy. And the Q&A function at the bottom, if you'd like to click on that and leave a question. We unfortunately won't have time for all of them, but we'd love to address some of your questions with Andy. And I'm hoping Andy might also take us through a little bit of live mindfulness at some point during our time together as well. So without further ado, let's dive in. Andy, it's, as you said, kind of a weird time right now. There's been a global crisis for over half a year now that sort of has seemed to ebb and flow a bit, real spikes of terrible worries, feelings of things perhaps relaxing a little bit. Just, from a mental perspective, it's been a crazy roller coaster of uncertainty, anxiety for many people. What are your reflections on that? And how's it been for you? I know you're in your studio right now where you do all your recording. How's your experience been?
So on a personal level, I'm very grateful that we're in the situation that we are in. The families remain sort of healthy and well. And I think we've had a few people in the team catch COVID, but thankfully they're okay as well. Like most people, the working sort of situation has changed greatly. We shut all of our offices very early on. And like a lot of offices here in America, they won't be opening again until 2021, probably quite far into 2021 as well. The only place we kept open was this place, was the recording studio. And the sound engineers can dial in remotely. So I've been here on my own for the last 6 months, which on the one hand, I feel a little bit bad for my wife because she's at home with the kids. The schools still aren't open here. And a lot of my friends are very jealous that I have a place to come to every day. On the other hand, we just wouldn't be able to kind of keep up with putting out the content that we do put out if we hadn't kept it open. So my wife is very understanding. Yeah.
And in terms of the sort of global situation, presumably you've seen a huge demand for what you do because so many people have been really, really challenged at this time.
Yeah, I think it's changed hugely. I think, and it's difficult to talk about, although it's by definition, the pandemic is global. At the same time, so many of us are in different situations. And I know of people who have lost loved ones. I know people who've lost their homes. I know people who've lost their jobs. And so people have been affected in so many kind of different ways. I think the overwhelming theme of course, is one of stress and anxiety. And we saw even in the earliest kind of week or two, we saw a spike in a lot of our content, especially the stress and anxiety content, by over 1,000%. I mean, like a massive leap in the media starts of that kind of content. And then as we continue through the pandemic, yeah, we've seen a steady increase. And I think it is just reflective of people are having a really tough time, you know. And Mark, I know you and I talked about this right at the start as we were just kind of catching up just now, but I'll repeat it again at the end. I'd really like to say it kind of in advance now. One of the reasons we've seen a lot more people come to Headspace is because we launched a number of initiatives, conscious that people were having a tough time and wouldn't necessarily have access to Headspace. So we made it free for all healthcare practitioners, doctors, nurses, NHS staff. We made it free for all educators, for teachers, and for those folks who aren't teachers, who aren't healthcare staff, we made it available there's a place in the app called Weathering the Storm, where people can actually go and get mindfulness for free with Headspace. So I think part of the increase has been simply the level of stress that everyone's feeling. And part of it has been, as we've launched these initiatives, we've seen more and more people sort of come into the community. But just an exceptionally difficult time for everyone, I think.
Well, and kudos to you and many other organisations for stepping up and showing such generosity in really difficult times. I think actually I was reflecting, I did an interview with a newspaper today about, in some ways, the lockdown period has been the greatest outpouring of human solidarity, certainly in our lifetimes and perhaps in many generations, although there's been obvious exceptions that the media loves to focus on. Actually, the vast majority of people have been unbelievably tolerant, patient, compassionate, thoughtful, generous. And I think that's really nice to remember at a time that there's all the doom and gloom in the news around us. Yeah,
for sure. I think, you know, I can't think of another time where there has been that level of solidarity. I think I'm pretty sure I keep up with the news back home. I get the sense that there's some degree of political sort of turmoil and division going on over there. There certainly is here. And I feel kind of that is where the media likes to place its focus. And if you were to purely kind of watch that day to day, you know, I think we could all very easily come away with a sense of, wow, the world is in turmoil. And I think there are kind of real challenges in, you know, multiple countries around the world. And yet I still believe kind of in that sense that all of us kind of connect sort of from a point of sort of human nature and the human condition. And if we spend time with one another, and if we're not too attached to our own opinions, and if we are curious and interested in the people around us, we'll always find a place of connection, and we'll always find sort of space for empathy and compassion for other people in our life.
Well said. Now, Andy, I know lots of people here will be familiar with some of your story and the journey to what's become this sort of global phenomenon with Headspace. I don't think we've got time to revisit all of that now, but one thing that's often struck me when I've heard you talk is you made that, what for many people is quite a radical decision, to leave, you know, conventional Western life and go and spend many years training as a Buddhist monk. And you mentioned, I think, that there have been some quite traumatic incidents in your life around that time that were behind that. Do you want to perhaps replay some of that for us and take us through what was going on for you at that period?
Yeah, it's funny, you know, I think as so often in life, it's only almost sort of retrospectively, you can kind of see how things played out. If you'd have asked me at the time, I'm not sure I've been able to articulate what was happening and why I made the decisions I made. But as I look back now, it's a lot clearer. And definitely there was a period of time kind of in my late teens where my stepsister was out cycling and a van driver fell asleep, knocked her off a bike and killed her. And then I was standing with a group of friends outside. This was within months of each other. Standing with a group of friends, Christmas Eve, early Christmas morning, and a drunk driver crashed into the group and killed 2 people and put about another 12 in intensive care. And I was lucky I didn't get hit. But I think that started off an internal dialogue for me which, you know, you think of it as an early midlife crisis or, you know, some kind of existential sort of search, but definitely a greater search for purpose, meaning, fulfillment. And like I think like most of us in life, when difficult things happen, I at first looked for distraction. I tried everything to distract myself, to get away from it mentally. And didn't do too bad a job. I managed to go for, a few years doing that until eventually it just sort of caught up with me. And I really felt like there was nowhere to go with it. I couldn't outrun it. Wherever I went, kind of my mind came with me. And even if I was able to temporarily block out what was happening in my mind, I would still wake up the next morning and it would be there. So I think all of those things kind of collectively led to a decision to be a monk. But I do think it's really important to say it wasn't just born out of kind of that tragedy. I think that was part of it, but I always see it as kind of almost dual kind of path. I'd grown up, my mum had introduced meditation very early on. It'd kind of been around. And so I feel like on the one hand, it was an escape from a very challenging time and a mind that was frequently overwhelmed. And at the same time, it was a search. And it was a search for meaning and purpose. And one, I think, can feel maybe a bit more sort of negative and one can feel a bit more positive. I feel like it was maybe sort of a balance of the two.
And so you went off and spent these years learning practices. And of course, you've decided, and maybe we could hear a bit more about that decision, to come back and bring that to the masses in a sort of secular context, which has obviously really, really worked. And I know Rich, your partner, has been a big part of helping to bring that to life, and obviously now many hundreds of others along the way. But I think people will be interested to know what practices you personally have, maybe that you learnt in those years, or perhaps that you've learnt since, because you've obviously spent so much time teaching people. So many people on this call and many others will hear your voice, as I do, regularly in headphones and so on. Yeah. What do you do yourself, Andy, to sort of stay mindful? What's your practice in terms of meditation and so on?
Yeah, so I look at sort of meditation and mindfulness as side by side, and I think they're both equally important. I'm assuming that most people will kind of know, but I maybe shouldn't assume. So mindfulness is the ability to be more present, not distracted, sort of more curious and interested sort of throughout the day. And meditation being a really good way of sort of learning that skill, familiarizing yourself with the ability to be present. So I think they're both equally important. And for me still now, meditation is part of my daily routine. So when I was at the monastery, just before I left, actually, about a year before I left, I was due to go into another retreat. And it was a quite a long retreat. It was a 4-year retreat. And as a consequence, I took a whole lot of commitments. So I had to learn the sort of the outline of probably another 20-25 new techniques that specific to that retreat. And I had to make commitments to practice some of those for the rest of my life. And those commitments are actually regardless of whether you're a monk or not. So I have those commitments for the rest of my life. The nice thing they do, if you leave the monastery, they recognize that you don't have 16 hours a day to practice meditation. So they shrink them down and they kind of, you can still practice them. So I'm able to do it in, something like about an hour a day. So that meditation is still a really important part of my daily practice. But more than that, I would say, is just trying to bring that spirit of mindfulness. And mindfulness gets defined and categorized in lots of different ways. I feel like the emphasis is often in the West too much on focus and attention, and that it is about awareness. Now, I think about it like the sun, if this helps. The light of the sun is kind of the awareness, it's the clarity component, but the sun also has warmth. So mindfulness isn't just about awareness and attention, it's also about compassion and kindness. So I try as much as possible to cultivate those qualities of both warmth and light, awareness and compassion, and sort of just bring that into daily life. And you said at the start, Mark, and this is always kind of an awkward one. I guess you have to call me something. But I often get referred to as an expert. That's, just to be clear, that's not how I see it. I see myself as a student of mindfulness. And I think that's really important. I feel like that is the spirit, actually, of mindfulness. It's not that we go and do it, we learn it, we're done, and then we're sorted for the rest of our life. It's kind of how do we continually sort of turn up? And I'm very comfortable sitting here saying that sometimes I forget and I don't necessarily show up with those qualities. And I do, still kind of get overwhelmed in really kind of challenging situations. I think the difference is that it doesn't tend to stick around for quite as long as it used to, and it doesn't overwhelm me in the way that it used to. So for anyone kind of practicing, you know, I always like to just be really kind of clear that is the practice. That's why it's called a practice. There is no kind of finish line, if you like.
Very wise. I think what I've been practicing, not nearly to the extent that a monk would, but regularly for well over a decade now. And well, I think one of the things I noticed early in my mindful journey was that I would begin to develop an awareness sort of shortly after the moment. I like to think of it. So I might have been in a conversation or in an incident and be like, oh goodness, gosh, I was quite angry just then. And I began to sort of look back on how I'd been in the moment, what I was feeling, and being more in touch with my emotions and feelings and thoughts, but perhaps a little bit, almost like regretfully, a bit like, oh, if only I'd seen that at the time, even if it was 5 minutes later or seconds later. And gradually I've occasionally reached those points where in the moment I've been able to say, I'm angry right now. Let's just listen to this and let's notice this. So I can do that, I can do it. I might practice the mindfulness peacefully at home, but in that moment of conflict or feeling like someone's challenging you or there's a real health risk or something, that ability to sort of be there right then is still incredibly hard after many years of trying it. Is there anything other than just repetition that helps with that?
Yeah, like what's the secret? What's the magic bullet to actually making it sort of stick? I mean, there's a reason that people spend their entire lives sort of studying this stuff. It takes time, and I think on the one hand you could look at that and say, well, what's the point if it takes that long? But we still get the benefits along the way. Maybe to begin with, it might even take a day to realize, wow, I was really angry yesterday. And then over time, maybe it's a few hours, then it's 10 minutes, then it's a few minutes, then it's a few seconds. And maybe we get to a point where we're not even identifying with the anger anymore. So in that moment of frustration, we're aware of the anger, but there's less of, oh, I'm so angry, and kind of creating the story out of it. There is simply the awareness of anger. And in giving it permission to be present, we also give it permission to sort of to disappear and to let go of it as well. So it is just, unfortunately, it is just practice. But I feel like that's true of pretty much most things in life. The things that are really valuable, we need to continually cultivate those qualities and skills.
Yeah, and I was slightly reluctant to say what I'm about to say now, but I was doing my Headspace this morning and saw that I'm on a streak of 800 plus days now on the app. And at one level, I'm sort of like, okay, this is something I've obviously put a lot of time into building over time. And at another level, I think how ridiculous that, first of all, I care about that number. And secondly, that I might then mention it to Andy on a webinar. I mean, what kind of weird ego-seeking behavior is that? So what do you think about gamification and the fact that these little nudges can help us build habits? But of course, the idea of wanting to meditate in order to make your daily score go up is almost the antithesis of being in the moment.
Well, one, congratulations on the commitment for 800 days. Like, it's a lot of days, whichever way you look at it. It comes up so often, this question, that we even kind of have written blogs, or I've written blogs on it over time. I think there's a balance. I think some people are motivated by that number, and that's a good thing to to come back and to see that. Other people aren't, they find it off-putting. Great, don't look at it, kind of leave it alone. It actually comes from, most people assume that it comes from sort of Silicon Valley and the gamification in other products. It actually comes from the monastery in which I trained. So in the Tibetan monastery in which I trained, we basically we would do 100,000 of a certain practice. We would be counting them as we kind of went. And then to make up for sort of any loss of concentration or distraction, we would have to add 10% of that. So it was then 110,000. And then for the 10,000, any loss of concentration, we'd have to add another 10%. So it was 111,000. And we'd have to do that many practices of a certain technique. And then we would finish that and start a new one. So the idea of, it's more a sense of, with meditation being a lifelong journey, for some people, that's so broad. It's so what? Like just for the rest of my life? To actually be able to kind of have a clearer sense of direction. Okay, I'm on this day, and then I'm on this day, actually can be really comforting and makes it feel a bit sort of smaller and a bit more sort of manageable. So that idea of I think it was called a run streak in the app, but the idea of just sort of knowing where we are on that journey. And for some people that can be really motivating, I think is a really sort of well-trodden path.
And in a moment, I'd love us to hear your voice in that form that many of us are used to as well. I mean, you must get so confused by people coming up to you, feeling like they know you because they've heard you in their headphones for years and have never met you before. That must be a common experience. But one of the things I always love in those sessions is that you often invite us not just to think about how this practice will benefit us, but how it will benefit others around us. Now, as you know, that's very much at the heart of our mission with Action for Happiness, that the happiness of others, the happiness of each other, the sort of collective good is the real motivator. How true is that? Because people, I think, sometimes criticize modern mindfulness, perhaps letting go of a bit of the loving compassion practice in the Buddhist tradition. Do you think that mindfulness naturally yields pro-social behavior?
It's a great question. I think it ultimately comes down to intention. So is it possible to use mindfulness and yet not necessarily tap into that altruistic sort of quality? It probably is. I'm sure mindfulness, focused attention has been used in that way over time. But I think if we go into it with the intention to be more aware, to be more curious, to be more interested in how the mind works, how and why we do and say the things that we do, and in understanding the neurosis of our own mind, better understand the sort of the neurosis of the human condition, I think inevitably we become more empathetic, we become more sort of altruistic. I have seen, I think there's now, someone told me there's something like sort of 5,000 mindfulness apps or, digital kind of offerings. And I don't know them, and I've genuinely never used or looked at any of them, and deliberately so. So I don't have a strong opinion kind of about it, but I do know that many have started more as a business kind of idea rather than necessarily from those core values of compassion and awareness and wanting to just, make those more available. So there is always the risk that those things that they do get missed. So I would just always encourage anyone that when you're looking for something, and there are so many great offerings out there, just make sure, look into it a little bit, but understand it kind of better, like what feels right for you, this is your mind. And I really see it, for me, this was sort of going away to the monastery and finding a teacher. It was explained to me like this, if you're physically ill in some way, you go to a hospital, you want to find a doctor. You don't just want to find a doctor who's read books. You want to find a doctor who's actually cut people open and done the operation. It's really scary to go under the knife with a doctor who's just come out of university. In the same way, if we're going to learn about the mind and understand the mind, it's good to find someone who's spent a good period of time with their mind and has a good understanding of the journey of meditation.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. And I'm seeing lots of wonderful comments on the chat. So thank you everyone for sharing this, both their own personal experiences of Headspace, but also reflections on what you're saying, Andy. You must be amazed with the success that Headspace has had and the obvious need. I think one of the things that's changed hugely in the time since we first met, that sort of last decade, has been the general public conversation about mental health. I think, to talk about how we feel, to talk about our vulnerabilities, to talk about our inner lives, if you like, wasn't commonplace a decade ago. It's still not nearly as widespread as it should be, but from celebrities to royals to day-to-day leaders and friends, we seem to be getting better at saying, I'm not okay. It's okay not to be okay. Here's what's going on. And I think the mindfulness revolution has really been part of that. How do you see that cultural shift? Because it feels very positive to me. Do you think that's right?
I think so. I mean, it blows my mind to look at those 10 years, the difference in those 10 years. I was fortunate in the sense of growing up in a household where those things were talked about, a lot, mostly through my mum's work as a therapist. But I know for most people, that absolutely wasn't okay. And they didn't feel safe. They didn't feel confident in saying how they felt, and especially in sharing that with others. And I think over the last 10 years, Yeah, I think mindfulness has been one part of the conversation. I think that there have been sort of multiple waves and multiple shifts and so many contributors to that movement. But mindfulness and the adoption of mindfulness, I think, has inevitably kind of brought that to the forefront, because you can't really talk about mindfulness without talking about our vulnerability, without talking about, you know, feeling stressed, feeling overwhelmed, feeling anxious, feeling sad. And sometimes people say, yeah, but what about the good stuff? You know, well, I don't feel like that all the time. Why don't you talk about feeling happy and elated and joy? And all that stuff is amazing. And I'd love to talk about that all day long. It's just that most of us don't struggle with that. We don't feel like we need help when we're joyful, when we're excited, when we're happy. We feel like we need help when we feel overwhelmed, you know, when we're stressed and anxious. So the reason we kind of focus on those things is for that reason. But I've seen it as, I don't know, personally, I feel like it's a really positive trend, and I hope it continues.
Just one final thing before we do a little mindful pause and then turn to some of these wonderful questions that are coming up. There's a lot that needs to change in the world. Many of us are upset about the fear of climate change. We're worried about the polarization in our political discussions. We're worried about systemic racism, sort of social justice issues, and things need to change. And yet the art of mindfulness, the practice of mindfulness, is about being still and really sort of tuning into what's going on here right now. And a critique is to say, how can sitting still doing nothing possibly create a world where we have the agency to go and make the change happen? There's a wonderful group you might know called the Mindfulness Initiative in the UK, who've done a lot of work with parliamentarians and so on, who had a report out this week talking about the link between mindfulness and agency, that actually when we do these mental practices, we become more able to be a change agent, make a change. How do you see that? Is that true?
I mean, that's certainly my understanding of mindfulness. There is this, you know, I don't like to spit it out, but just for this, obviously, there's a sort of a passive element of mindfulness and there's an active element of mindfulness. The passive element is undoubtedly learning how to settle the mind, how to experience a quieter mind, a clearer mind. But the reason we do that is not so we can sit there with our eyes closed, kind of experiencing bliss while there's suffering going on all around us in the world. Is so that we can take those qualities of mind and actually apply them to our life and to the lives of the people around us, our communities, to society. So often, I think when we see things happen, we feel angry, you know, or we feel anxious, and we get consumed by those feelings. In fact, we get so overwhelmed by them that we often sort of freeze. We're not able to act, or we become very reactive. And we're not necessarily acting in a way that is helpful. It's loud and it's heard, but it's not always helpful. And so I actually think if we could bring a greater sense of calm and clarity to actions that will help change many of these situations in the world, that can only be a good thing. So my hope is that through the cultivation of awareness and compassion, we become more aware of the struggles going on in the world and have a greater desire to actually engage with those things and to sort of have a meaningful impact on those things.
Well, let's put some of that awareness and compassion into practice, shall we, Andy? I'd love to invite you to guide us through just a few minutes of whatever feels most topical and relevant to you, really.
I'd be happy to. So, no, I think, I don't know, last time we got together, did we do Tonglen? We do something. Right. I think it just reminded me where we're up to in the UK. Well, I know this is people from all around the world. In the UK, you're out of lockdown, aren't you? But there's still some separation going on.
Well, it just feels like it's the beginning of a downward trend here again, in that having opened up quite broadly, there's now new constraints coming in and people are getting quite anxious moving into the winter period. A lot of uncertainty, case numbers are up, but deaths are thankfully still not any higher. But I would say that, like many parts of the world, and a bit like the US has been for the last 3 or 4 months, there's been a real sense of, gosh, this certainly hasn't gone away yet.
Yeah. Okay. So I think given that, I'm assuming that there will be lots of people tuning in who either can't right now be with people who they would like to be with, or haven't been able to be with for sort of quite some time. So I think we'll do something sort of around sort of loving kindness, perhaps. And so if before we even start, as you're tuning in today, if you can have in mind a particular person who you care about, who you already feel a sense of love toward, but who you haven't necessarily been able to connect with on a physical level for some time, it'd be great. And we're gonna sort of bring that person into the meditation. But to start with, and if you use Headspace, you'll know this start already. But it's always helpful just to take a moment just to sort of settle the body, settle the mind. And we're actually going to start with the eyes open. So it's a soft focus. So we're not staring at one particular thing. We're sort of taking in the whole space around us. So without moving the eyes, there's just a soft focus, and maintaining that soft focus, just taking a couple of big, deep breaths. Breathing in through the nose and out through the mouth. So as you breathe in through the nose, just noticing that intake of air, perhaps the lungs expanding. As you breathe out, just noticing how the muscles in the body soften a little bit. And with the next out breath, just gently closing the eyes. And just taking a moment before you do anything else, just to enjoy that feeling of having stopped, not having anything to do for the next couple of minutes, nowhere to go. And just feeling the weight of the body pressing down. Whether it's down against the seat beneath you, the floor beneath you. You might be lying down, just noticing the weight, the contact of the body pressing down. And you can just allow the breath to return to its natural rhythm. And just take a moment as well, just to check in with the body. So often the mind is so busy, we're not actually aware of how the body feels. So maybe the body feels a little bit heavy today. Maybe it feels very light. Maybe there's a sense of restlessness in the body. Or maybe the body feels very still. Just becoming more aware of how the body feels. And as you become more aware of those physical sensations in the body, just starting to notice the movement of the breath. So it's that rising and falling sensation. So for some of you, you might feel it in your chest. For others, it'll be more in the diaphragm, sometimes in the stomach. If you can't feel anything, just gently place your hand on the stomach, just so you can feel that rising and falling sensation. And we're just going to stay with that just for the next 20, 30 seconds before beginning a very short visualization. So remember, it's natural for thoughts to come and go. Just allowing any thoughts to come and go. And each time you realize the mind's wandered off, just gently coming back to that rising and falling sensation. So just settling the body and settling the mind. And now I'd like you to bring that person to mind. So imagine them sitting somewhere comfortably, their favorite spot. Maybe it's their favorite chair in their house, maybe it's out in nature somewhere, but a place you know they would be comfortable, you know they'd be happy. And we're going to imagine that with every breath, with every out breath, every exhalation, that person begins to look a little happier, a little more at ease. So as you focus on this image of the person, maybe you start to see their shoulders begin to drop. You start to see any tension release from their body. Maybe you start to see a smile begin to appear on their face. And just continue with that exercise, just for the next 20 seconds or so. With each out breath, just seeing that person look increasingly happy, increasingly at ease. Again, remember, it's natural for the mind to wander off. If that happens, no problem. You just see it, let it go, and come back to that feeling and that picture in the mind. And so seeing that person look as happy now as you can imagine them looking, and feeling a sense of happiness for them. Just now allowing that image to dissolve, and for the next 10 seconds, just letting the mind do whatever it wants to do. So no need to focus on anything. If the mind wants to think, you can let it think. Just allowing the mind to be free. And then just very gently bringing that focus back into the body. Just coming back to that feeling of weight, contact. And whenever you're ready, you can just gently open the eyes again.
Thank you, Andy. I always enjoy that experience, and it's really nice to have a chance to do that with you live and with so many others live at the same time. A few people have been who are obviously new to Headspace, have been asking a little bit about what is this? Is it an app? Is it free to download, and so on? Do you want to just give us the really quick overview to anyone who hasn't heard of, how they can get hold of this before?
Yeah, for sure. So you can download Headspace. It's like any other app, or you can come to our website and do it that way. There is a trial kind of part, and you can use that forever. We've had people using it for free, that trial part, for the last 8 years now, and still doing so. Or if you want to go deeper into other kind of courses, there's a paid for kind of part of the app as well. But again, just to re-emphasize, if you can't afford to pay for it, don't want to pay for it, there's a whole collection in there of exercises called Weathering the Storm, for stress, for anxiety, how to incorporate mindfulness into movement, into your sleep, into your eating. It's available for free. Again, if you're a teacher, if you're a healthcare worker, it's available. The app is available to.
And Andy, on that, a few people have asked, if they are a teacher or a healthcare worker, how do they get that? Do they have to enter a special code? Is there a different link?
Yeah.
How do they get access?
So there's a code, and that's why it's taken us sort of a long time in different countries to roll these out, because we need sort of national codes. Ping us an email, help@headspace.com, and we will send you out a code that you can use to download the app.
Wonderful. So I'd love to come to some of these great questions that have been coming in. And I want to start with the tough one, actually, but I think it's on topic for lots of people right now. Kasha has asked, hi, Andy, please can you advise me how I can be more mindful and accepting each and every day when living with complex PTSD and post-traumatic stress and a chronic illness and disability every day? She says, with blessings, thank you. And although that's a very specific example with Kasha, I think many people are dealing with quite complicated traumatic situations, whether that's to do with the current crisis, a long-term health condition, or anything else. How can they use some of these ideas in that situation?
Yeah. Well, the first thing to say is, I think you know, and it's really important thing to say is that mindfulness is, again, it's not a magic kind of bullet. It doesn't change our situation necessarily. What it changes is our relationship to the situation. It changes our perspective of the situation. So it means that even in sort of very difficult situations, we are better able to manage and we're better able to cope. Now look, the spectrum of struggle, stress and suffering in the world is so kind of huge. I can't sort of talk to all of it. I think at one end of the spectrum, we kind of have mindfulness more as a tool of resiliency, almost sort of more like a sort of a vitamin idea where we practice mindfulness so that when we sort of experience stress in our lives, we are better able to cope with those situations. And then at the, you know, we have it where we can use it to manage difficult situations, and in a clinical setting, even to sort of treat difficult situations. I think the important thing, if we have been struggling or are in a very difficult situation, it's really the storyline in our mind almost inevitably will be one of, it's not fair. And for sure, it won't feel fair. But in that moment, can we use mindfulness to step out of that storyline and experience peace of mind? It doesn't in any way negate the severity or seriousness of the situation or that feeling of it not being fair, but it does allow us to step out of the storyline of that for long enough so that we experience peace of mind, so that when we come back sort of out of our meditation, hopefully we're able to feel a greater sense of sort of, whether it's a greater sense of confidence, a greater sense of, really a greater sense of courage in being vulnerable. You know, I feel like there is an idea with mindfulness as well in the West that it's kind of, okay, how do I make myself invincible from sort of stress in the world? I'd say it's actually or how do I control the mind? I'd say it's the opposite. It's how do we learn to let go of control? And how do we get comfortable with being vulnerable, with not knowing, the uncertainty of all of our lives? So my hope is that as those qualities begin to come into one's lives, it inevitably changes the relationship between ourselves and what's happening, what's going on in our lives.
Thank you. And you're reminding me of when we first launched the Action for Happiness course. You know, we have all these volunteer-led community courses. A lady called Jasmine, who's become a good friend in the years since, came along to a course, and she was dealing with chronic pain and learnt mindfulness through a connection to John Kabat-Zinn, in that case, that we helped enable. And she said a phrase which I'll never forget, which was, although my pain hasn't changed, my relationship to my pain has changed completely, which I think is a nice example of what you said. It's not taking away the suffering, but it's
Absolutely.
somehow changing the connection to it.
Yeah, very much so.
Andy, we live in a world of digital social media, social comparison, some of which is great, some of which is really quite toxic. And a lot of people, I'm always shocked how many people have got sort of self-doubt and also rather mean voices in their heads. I think we all underestimate how much that's a universal thing. Yeah. Alistair's asked, just quite simply, he's just said, I hate myself. Do you have any advice on how I can attain self-acceptance?
Yeah.
Big question.
Yeah, big question. And I think you're right. So many of us do have that judgmental, critical sort of aspect of mind. When you consider what meditation, what mindfulness is, the practice of non-judgmental awareness, we are quite literally learning how to give those things up. Again, I feel very often we're presented with the wrong side of the coin. It's kind of, okay, so if I don't like myself, I need to focus on liking myself more. I actually don't see it that way round. I see that underneath the critical chatter, underneath the dislike for oneself, there is a place of equanimity where there is a sense of kindness to oneself and to others. It's how do we uncover that? So it's not what do we need to start doing to like ourselves more, it's what do we need to let go of in order to uncover that innate sense of sort of kindness towards oneself. So as much as possible, I think the practice of meditation, the practice of mindfulness will allow us to let go of that critical chatter. It will allow us to step out of that thinking. It will allow us to, and we know, again, this isn't just, it's really important to say, this isn't just sort of my point of view. We currently have 70 clinical trials in the pipeline at Headspace. 25 are already finished, peer reviewed and published. But we know through a lot of those trials that not only does it decrease irritability and that sort of judgmental, critical part of the mind, but it also helps to increase compassion and empathy. And compassion and empathy isn't, I don't know why it's happened this way, but when it's talked about, it's always kind of like well, there's me and there's them. Okay, I'm feeling compassion for that. Compassion is all encompassing. Compassion is not a line kind of here. If we're practicing compassion, we are practicing compassion for ourselves and for everyone else. So to look at it in that way, I think is a much more healthy way of looking at it.
And on that theme of empathy that you've just mentioned, Andy, Rex has said, Andy, my question is, how can we have empathy for family members who do not respect or are unkind to us? And he goes on, but I think that the sense of that question is really important. And I think many of us, much of this us versus them sort of polarization we're seeing in society comes from the fact that we feel wronged in some way, whether that's by a family member or somebody else. How do we keep empathy when we're experiencing, nasty behavior in some way?
Yeah, as my teacher used to say, that's advanced practice. Dealing with family members, that's advanced practice. I think, look, it's challenging, isn't it? And especially kind of in the current situation where we're all sort of pushed together and we're having to spend more time sort of with one another. I think as much as possible, the more we witness the comings and goings of our own mind, the more I think empathetic we're able to be with others. Because if we truly witness our mind, not sitting down trying to experience silence or trying to relax, but truly witnessing the mind in all of its, the good, the bad, the ugly, everything, the richness of the mind, then we start to see. And even if we just look back over our own lives, like none of us have lived a life, or at least I can only speak for myself. I haven't lived a life, which is, I can look back and say, oh, that was spotless, never been at fault, never said anything wrong, never done anything wrong. And so I think if we kind of keep that context in mind, mindfulness is not an enabler. It's really important to say, if someone is doing something to hurt another person and intentionally and knowing it, mindfulness isn't about saying, oh, that's okay, let's just accept it. If you're in that situation, absolutely, it's about having that ability, the clarity to see it, to call it out, to ask for a change, and if it doesn't change, to take some other kind of action. But in the situation, just in the everyday comings and goings of our characters and personalities, and we are all different, I think mindfulness allows us to sort of give a little more kind of leeway. I remember, Mark, just real quickly, going into the first monastery and saying to, actually it was the second monastery, saying to the teacher, I'd really like to go into retreat, and I'd like to do it solitary. I'd like to be on my own. And he roared with laughter. And and he said, no. He said, first you go into retreat with a lot of people. He said, it's a bit like sort of a rock tumbler. He said, right now, all of you you've all got very sort of sharp sort of angles. He said, put you all in the kind of tumbler together, and over time you kind of bang against each other, and you become smoother rocks. Once you're a nice smooth rock, then you can go and practice solitary retreat. And I feel like it's easy to look at these situations in life, the challenging relationships, and to think that they're somehow an obstacle to our practice, rather than seeing them actually, they are very often an opportunity to learn more about ourselves and to learn more about the human condition.
I love that. And it reminds me of something that my colleague, Alex, who's very wise, often says to me, which is, things are either good or good practice.
Yeah.
Which is nice.
Yeah,
Gabriel has asked an interesting question. Hi, Andy, do you sometimes feel too aware of your thoughts that it becomes overwhelming? And I think there are some people who say that, if you are dealing with really traumatic situations, a mindful practice that heightens your attention on that might trigger some other trauma. How do you feel about that?
So there's kind of two components of that. I think and I'll come to the awareness one second. I think what often happens with mindfulness practice is that we become aware of thoughts and we then start thinking about those thoughts. So we start thinking about thinking, and that can often feel like it's amplifying a problem. So it takes a little while to realize, oh, that's just more thinking. Okay, well, we can kind of afford to let go of that. I think there are some people who simply, in opening up the floodgates of the mind, they become more aware. of thoughts and feelings that they weren't previously aware of. Now, sometimes that can be a surprise. Sometimes it can be shocking. I've certainly experienced that in my time. And people often ask me kind of, what's your experience in meditation? And meditation is different every day. Sometimes it's a smile. Sometimes there are tears. It varies from time to time. I think the most important thing is allowing those thoughts to arise. But if we get to a point where we feel overwhelmed by them and we feel not able to cope with them, then it's really important to reach out to, whether it's through an organization like yourselves, Mark, who I know you have lots of sort of places you can recommend to people, whether it's to a family friend, whether it's to a health professional, but just making sure that you have the support around you. Because yes, definitely, there have been cases where people have become aware of things they weren't previously aware of, and they found that really sort of difficult to cope with.
Thanks, Andy. I'd like to come on to the next generation, to children and helping children learn mindfulness.
Yeah.
Well, I mentioned to my kids I was going to be talking to you on this evening, and they said, "Hi, I'm Andy," because of course that's what they've heard you say at the beginning of their kids' mindful sessions they've done. I mean, I know Headspace has provided some stuff to children. How do you feel about this as a sort of life skill? Because I can't help but feel that this should be fundamental to the curriculum for every human being as they're growing up.
Yeah, I find it extraordinary that the things, when I look back at my school curriculum, the things that we did learn that I've never used in my life, and to think that, wow, and there wasn't room for happiness, kindness, patience, generosity, kind of awareness. I think it's absolutely an essential part of the curriculum. I think it is becoming increasingly commonplace in the schools. Certainly out here, we work with over 100 different sort of school districts. It's available in lots and lots of schools. We work with Sesame Street to make it sort of a bit more friendly and approachable. I was, I mentioned at the start, I was probably like 10 or 11 when I started learning. It was a really valuable tool then. And with my kids now, they're 3 and 6. And people assume that I have 2 little kind of Buddhas at home sitting there kind of in lotus position, and it's a really peaceful household. They're 2 young boys with lots of energy. Our house is a zoo. And if I can, my job, from a mindfulness point of view, my job is to create a space. It's to create a space where we are practicing mindfulness as parents, but it's also to create a space of invitation to the kids. So it's not, you must meditate, kind of, right, you've been naughty, go upstairs and meditate. It's kind of, okay, this is happening at this time every day. We're going to do it. We'd love you guys to join in as well. Maybe it's just before bed or something like that. It's not this thing. It's just, okay, this is happening. It's going to be 1 minute. It's going to be 2 minutes. It's going to be 3 minutes, and making it sort of feel like, more of a game and more of a sort of a treat rather than a chore. And I think that will be the difficult line to walk in schools as it becomes part of a curriculum. Because I remember how I felt about, most parts of my curriculum. You're basically just getting told to do stuff. So how do you make it feel more like a treat and less like a chore? But it's happening. I think it is happening.
Yeah, setting Headspace as homework probably isn't the right answer, is it?
Yeah, exactly.
Andy, I know, having known you for years, I know you've got a strong sort of personal ethic around wanting to help others, and that's what, one of the reasons you left the monastery to come back and spread this. But of course, Headspace has become hugely commercially successful, and a couple of people have asked questions related to that. David, for example, has said, "Hi, Andy, you've a personal net worth from teaching mindfulness and meditation. Is there a conflict of interest there? How have you managed to balance what I'm sure have been some sort of really big questions around scaling up to reach more people versus keeping it true to its core essence?"
Yeah. And look, Rich and I were so naive when we started it. I think we both had this idea that we could do this without employing anybody, without raising any money. We genuinely thought we could. And yeah, looking back now, it was kind of so naive. If you want to scale something, it takes a lot of people. I'm not responsible for having done that. It's the team. The team have done an incredible job. We've got like 350 people now in the team, and they've kind of made that happen over time. So I think we started out as a not-for-profit in the UK as a charity. For us, that didn't kind of work well. It didn't enable us to move in the way that we wanted to move and as quick as we wanted to move. So we took a different approach and we said, okay, so what would happen if we did this privately? And that private kind of commercial arm was able to subsidize kind of a lot of other activity that was for free. And I think if you look at those recent initiatives, whether it's with healthcare and education, over the years we've made, I don't want to put a number on it, millions and millions, maybe kind of more, of subscriptions free to people around the world, to NGOs, to the likes of Oxfam and MSF. And, you know, when we get emails back from people in Syria who say, I use this when I hear the air raid sirens, we're not selling it to those people. You know, those people have free access to it, and we try as much as possible to make it free. But for Rich and I, for our personal stuff, we made a commitment. Rich was joking about this the other day. Even before we started, before we'd made any money, in fact, when we were still losing money, we made a commitment that, personally speaking, when we kind of, if we ever got to a stage that we were personally fortunate enough to make money, we would give that back. So for us, as we start to look to the future, and again, right now, like, it's very much kind of part of the company, right? It's not our personal wealth, although a number gets put on it. At some stage, if that happens, it's our intention to share that, to give that back. We spent a lot of time with the likes of Gates Foundation talking through kind of like, what are the steps that you need to take in order to make meaningful change and to do it in a skillful way, because it's not enough. And we don't want to just be writing checks. We want to be involved. We want to be engaged in sort of creating a better world and putting that money to good use.
Well, I just wanted to express gratitude personally, as someone who's used Headspace and known you, and very grateful for all you've done. But also, Action for Happiness has also received lots and lots of free Headspace subscriptions that we've then given out to volunteers and people on our community courses. So again, we've seen that firsthand, that generosity is real. And I'm seeing a huge amount of gratitude on the chat this evening, Andy, both for what you shared earlier, what you've said in the questions, and also for everything you've done. So on behalf of everyone here, thank you so much. We're sort of sadly out of time. Is there any sort of final closing thought you'd like to leave us with around the situation we're in as the global family and how we can potentially live wiser and kinder lives? Yeah,
well, first of all, just to apologize, I know you're looking at the stuff as it comes up. At the bottom of the screen, I can see it rolling, but I don't have the ability to focus on that at the same time. But thank you to everyone for tuning in and for all the lovely feedback. I think just to remember that everything changes all of the time, you know. Right now, especially the duration of this, it feels like we're stuck in time and like nothing is changing. It will take, I'm sure, I've no doubt, a long time for us to emerge. I think there is an idea that maybe we are going to return to how it was rather than necessarily evolve and continue changing. I feel like as I look back through my life, things are just always changing, whether it's in our personal life, in our communities, and on the global stage. Things will continue to change. If ever you feel stuck in your mind, or if you feel stuck with what's going on around you, I think it's really helpful just to remember that things are always changing, that nothing stays the same. And if we're able to live with that kind of freedom of mind, then we tend to find sort of a greater sense of happiness in our lives and maybe a little more space for those around us as well.
Well, on that lovely note, Andy, thank you so much for being here, for all that you're doing. Thank you to everyone who's joined us this evening for all your wise comments and lovely questions. Really, really been a joy to be together, and keep up the great work, Andy.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me back. It's good to see you again.